So we're starting chapter 2. Chapter 2 is all about cycles, specifically biogeochemical cycles, and we'll talk about that word in just a second. But if I could sum up chapter 2 with one word, chapter 2 is about matter. Chapter 1 was about energy. Where does the energy go? Chapter 2 is going to be about matter. Where do the atoms go? What is happening to actual molecules? So we're going to be talking about some of the same things, but now instead of talking about where energy is going, we're going to talk about matter. So this is the beginning of chapter 2, but we're still in the same unit that we were for chapter 1. So this is lesson number 4. In this lesson, which we will start today and you will finish tomorrow, we'll just be doing sort of the overview and a little bit about water and its properties. So the first thing that I'd like to do is talk about the thing that's the title of this section, biogeochemical cycles. Now you'll see right next to it, I wrote down energy and matter. And I wrote both of them because although this chapter is really about matter, nothing will happen to matter if there's no energy with it. So we really can't separate the two of them one from the other. And so we're just going to break down the title a little bit. If I have bio as part of a word, does anyone remember what that means? Like what the prefix bio means. So this is biology. What are we studying? We are studying life, correct? So bio means life. Does anyone know what the little piece of word geo means? Like geothermal energy or a geologist or geology. Yeah, it means earth. Now the word chemical doesn't really have any subtext to it. We're talking about substances. So a biogeochemical cycle is a cycle about a substance that allows life to exist on Earth. Very simply, that's what the word means. Now underneath the very bottom, I put the word cycle, and then I put driving force with a question mark. For any sort of substance that allows life to exist on Earth to cycle. Now the word cycle means that things are going to change form. Maybe a solid will turn into a liquid. Maybe a liquid will turn into a gas. Maybe a substance will go from a reduced form to an oxidized form. So in a cycle, we are talking about changing form, which very often involves changing state. And we're going to start with the cycle that you're the most familiar with, the water cycle, to illustrate it. But what force, what is the thing that causes substances that allow life to exist on Earth to change form or to change state? And the answer would be energy. Now, very often, the energy is coming from the sun. So you might recall that the original form of basically all the energy on our planet is the sun. It has changed form a bunch of times. So if I asked you what the driving force was for any of these cycles, you could tell me the sun, because that's the original form. But remember that the sun is also responsible for a bunch of other types of energy. For example, If anything happens because of heat, the sun is the reason generally that we have heat. Now, that's not a 100% rule. We know that there's geothermal energy as well, like there is in chemosynthetic food chains and undersea vents. But the sun is responsible for a large majority of heat. Anything that has to do with wind or with currents, so with air moving or with water moving, the sun is the cause of that. Because the sun heats our planet, heat causes water or air to move, and that's what causes wind, or that's what causes currents. And then the sun can indirectly be responsible for tons of other types of energy, like electrical energy, for example. So even though the sun might not be directly responsible for something happening, the sun is responsible originally. Maybe not the direct source right now, but somewhere. So all week this week, we are going to talk about different cycles of matter, so of actual atoms, of actual substances, and how they change form. All of these cycles are cycles that allow life to exist on Earth. We're not going to talk about every substance in the world. We're going to talk about a few of them. So we'll start by talking about water. Then we'll talk about carbon, and you kind of can't talk about carbon without talking about oxygen because they sort of go together. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about nitrogen and about phosphorus. We could, if we wanted to, talk about a bunch of other things. For example, sulfur is in your textbook as well. We're not going to talk about every cycle on the face of the planet. We're going to talk about a few of the major ones that exist. So we're going to start by talking about the water cycle. Now there is a picture here of the water cycle. If you were to look on page 35 of your textbook, it's not this exact picture, but it has the same pieces in it. Now the water cycle is one that I thought you would be familiar with, which is why it's a good one for us to start with. For each of the cycles that we'll talk about, in the notes, I have a sort of a picture representation of it. But then off to the side, I have some steps that are part of the cycle that I would like for us to describe. All right, so I think I'll go over these here so that we can fill in anything that needs to be filled in. The first one is evaporation. Can someone tell me what evaporation is? Yes. Okay, so water molecules being heated by the sun going into the atmosphere. Excellent description. Evaporation, then specifically, is when water turns from a liquid to a gas. Now, what's causing that? Exactly what Grace said. Heat, which is coming from the sun, is causing that change. And that's putting water in the atmosphere as opposed to in the ocean or in a river. Now, on the picture, both in your textbook and in the notes, it shows water evaporating just from a body of water, like from a lake or from an ocean. Is that the only place that water can evaporate from? So I'll ask you this. Can water evaporate from you? You are made of 80% water. Can your water evaporate? It can. If you are hot, water will evaporate. Even if you are not too hot, it's not super cold out today, so you won't be able to see, but when it is cold outside, you can see your breath. Why can you see your breath? Because water comes out every time you exhale. So evaporation, please note, also happens from organisms. People, animals, whatever. Organisms let water evaporate from them. So we are also a source of water evaporation. Now there's a specific word later on in the list that's just for plants that we'll mention, but just keep in mind organisms have water evaporating from them all the time. Now condensation is basically the opposite of evaporation. Condensation is when water that's a gas turns into water that is a liquid. Normally, we would represent condensation happening somewhere near a cloud. Because typically, when water condenses in the water cycle, we see some sort of precipitation falling. So condensation very often leads to precipitation. Now, that's not the only time condensation can happen. Condensation you would also see happening, say, on the window of your house, especially when it's cold outside. If it's very humid inside your house or inside of a building, you might see condensation form. You might also see condensation form, say, on the leaves of plants, especially in the morning when it's cooler. Water that was a vapor would turn into a liquid until it is heated up. Precipitation is the next one. So you can see precipitation here. It's illustrating rain. And I just want you to make sure that you know that precipitation can be solid or liquid, which means we're talking about snow, rain, hail, or any other description you want to use for stuff falling from the sky that is made up of water. Now the next thing on the list is transpiration. And transpiration sometimes gets missed on diagrams because it's a biotic or living component. It's a living organism that's doing this. If I was going to add transpiration in my diagram, I would add it right here, attached to a tree, but pointing basically the same direction that the evaporation arrow is pointing. Transpiration is when water evaporates from the stoma of plant leaves. So you might remember Science 10 learning that on leaves, particularly on the undersides, cells called guard cells will either open or close, leaving a little pore that water can escape the leaf from. So that's transpiration. So this is water evaporating from a plant. Don't confuse that with the word perspiration, which is what we call it when you sweat. Transpiration is kind of like a plant is sweating and water is leaving the plant. Perspiration is what we would call it for an animal or a human. Now number 5 is called runoff. And the thing that you should recognize here is that when we're talking about runoff, we are talking about water that is flowing on the surface of land. So runoff is water flowing on the surface. Where does runoff come from? It is usually coming from water that has melted and is turning into a liquid. So water flowing on surface, usually from ice or snow that has melted. So in the spring where we live, we will get a large amount of runoff from the mountain areas or anywhere that had snow in the winter, but that's what runoff is. Runoff is on the surface. Now the next word, percolation, you might have learned as leaching before. I know when I used to teach grade 9, I always made sure I showed both words, and then the word in French is not even close to the same as either one of those. But the word percolation is used to talk about water getting from the surface underneath the ground. So here's percolation right here. We're basically trying to show you that water can move through the ground. The ground is made up of soil and rocks that have spaces between them, and water can move through those spaces, and that eventually it's going to get much further underneath the ground. So percolation is movement from the surface to groundwater. So what is groundwater? Groundwater is water that is underneath the ground. Now I put groundwater and aquifers and water table kind of all together because they're all referring to water being under the ground. Groundwater is the very general term. An aquifer would be water storage underground, like where you have a big pool of water underneath the ground. An aquifer is generally where you would look to put a well. So if you were trying to get well water, does anyone here live out of town and have well water at their place? Okay, so a few of you do, so then you would know this. But that's how we decide kind of where to put a well, is we're looking for an underground aquifer that has lots of water available underground. This idea of well water is one that is frequently put in a question that I put on assignments and or tests. Because one of the things that we'll talk about isn't just water itself, but things that water can transport along with it. And so since things can dissolve in water, the fact that water can get into a well means that anything that's dissolved in water can get into a well as well. So a typical water cycle related question that I might ask you, let's say on a test, would be, how did some substance get in the well? That would be a really typical water cycle type question. And regardless of what the substance is, part of your answer would be to talk about percolation and groundwater. Now, depending on what the substance is, there might be other things that you would say. Maybe you would talk about how the substance started in the ocean and evaporated and then rain fell. But the idea here is that I would want you to recognize that if something got into a well, that means the water cycle played a role. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask so far? The last word here is just water table. Water table is a description of sort of how much underground water there is. So you might hear people talking about the water table being really high or the water table being really low. If any of you have any sort of a hill in your backyard or in your yard somewhere, you might have a good understanding of this. My backyard slopes, and so especially in the spring, the water table is very full, right? All the snow is melting, there's tons of water everywhere. And there is so much water that the ground in my backyard like literally cannot absorb all of the water. And so there's a part of my grass that's like a little bit of a lake for a while. We think that the developer who developed our street just did a poor job of leveling things, but whatever. The idea is that the water table is frequently so high that the ground can't even absorb the water. So if you've ever experienced that anywhere, where it's so wet outside that even the grass has puddles on it, whereas normally grass would absorb water, that means that the level of underground water is incredibly big. Now, the last thing that I want to do today is just go over very briefly what water is used for and where we get water from. And then in tomorrow's class, you'll work a little bit more on water and its properties. So over here, I just wanted to mention or remind you that water is incredibly important for living organisms. And since this is biology, that's what we care about. Aside from all of that environmental stuff where water evaporates and falls and runs on the surface and goes underground, Water is incredibly important for many metabolic processes. So, as an example, I will put hydrolysis. That is how all macromolecules, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, get broken down. If you don't have water, you can't digest things. The other thing that's incredibly important is that most living organisms are made up of mostly water. So depending on which organism it actually is, it could be 70% water. Some organisms, like a phytoplankton, are 99% water. So I'm just putting a note here, 70 to 99% of living organisms. So I don't mean 70 to 99% of the organisms. I mean of each organism's body, 70 to 99% of it is water when they're alive. When they're dead, everything changes because water doesn't hang around when things are dead. And then over here, I have just a little bit of information about how an organism would gain water versus how an organism would lose water. So I made it with pictures, but I'll just sum it up. What you eat generally contains water in it. It would be unusual for your food not to have a small portion of water in it, and some food has incredibly large portions of water. For example, I was just eating cucumbers, and those are basically all water when you eat them. Of course, you can drink. Now those are the two obvious ways to get water. The other two ways to get water would be to absorb. So that's a picture of skin there. Water can come in through your skin. Obviously for us that wouldn't be the number one way, but for some organisms, say, that live in water, water could come in directly through their skin or their membranes. Now the last picture there is a cell organelle. Does anyone recognize which one it is? So it's a mitochondria, and I'm just going to make a special note about this one. Mitochondrion is where cell respiration happens. And so you might say to yourself, well, that's super fantastic. How is that helping me get water? I will just remind you, during cell respiration, oxygen and glucose are converted into CO2 and water and energy and heat and a bunch of other stuff. But specifically, I'm focusing on water. This is called metabolic water. That is a term that you will have to use. That is a term that I will ask you about. And metabolic water will be fairly important for the thing that you do tomorrow that's on page 38. Some organisms have to rely on this because they cannot access water easily in their environment. Other organisms don't rely on it quite as much. On the right side here, I have all the ways that organisms lose water. Both of these are evaporation. The top one is showing a guy meditating and he's breathing. And the second one is showing someone sweating. So when you breathe, or when you sweat, or any kind of evaporation happens, that is causing you to lose water. And then, of course, urine and feces. We know that your urine is made up of water. We studied your kidneys and how they decide how much water to reabsorb. And we know that the amount of water in your feces is based on how much fiber there is in your diet. That's a picture of some sort of fancy type of poo that someone has in a collection, which I thought was kind of disgusting, so that's why I put it as a picture here.